Do, do, do. Right. Okay. So it looks like we're live. So that's fantastic. So, welcome everyone to our second edition or second live edition. Oh, I'm getting some strange feedback. Sorry about this, Nigel. I'm getting some weird. Yeah, why is that happening? Technical glitches. This didn't happen on the first one. Can you hear some feedback, actually? Let me close this one. There we go.
No. Nothing coming through here.
No, okay. I've just closed that. It's very strange. I'm getting a weird delayed feedback. Just bear with me. Ah, there we go. There we go. Just bear with me 1 second and then we'll get properly started. So the joys of technology. You think I'd know better. So let's just so I just need to get the chat window up so people can chat with me. So let me just bring that up. Wonderful. Okay, we're properly ready. So apologies for the slight delay, folks. So a few technical glitches. So welcome everyone to the second live edition of the AI Future Show. So for those of you that don't know, this is a hybrid show of a weekly podcast and a monthly live interview. So if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, it would be fantastic if you could take the time to do so. It's available on all of the major platforms. All the links to the podcast platforms are available on my website, and it would be fantastic if you were to subscribe to them, and also rate and review as well. That would be fantastic. A little bit of extra housekeeping, so apologies for the slight delay. I just wanted to get the chat window up for the live show. So if throughout this next hour you have any comments or questions for Nigel that you'd like me to discuss and challenge Nigel with, then feel free to post so I can get access to them through the system. So that's all great. So welcome, Nigel. Thank you very much for taking the time to sort of be here with me today. So AI ethics for me is just a fantastic topic to cover in this show, and it's an area that has been talked about a lot over the last couple of years. And for me, it's been quite frustrating that there's been lots of talk but very little action. So it's really great to see yourself and others actually working to sort of write that essentially, and to look at what can we actually do to address the various issues and challenges of AI ethics. But before we get into the detail on that, it would be great if you could just briefly introduce yourself and give people that maybe don't know you that well a little bit of your background. That would be fantastic just to get us started.
Yeah, very happy to do that. Thank you, by the way, for inviting me onto this. I'm delighted
You're
to
welcome.
be here and to be with you this evening. So I'm Nigel Crook. I'm a professor of artificial intelligence and robotics at Oxford Brookes University, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Ethical AI. Very briefly, my background is I've spent more than 30 years as an academic teaching and researching in AI. A bit of a nomad wandering around the discipline, ranging from medical diagnostic systems to explanation and transparency to machine learning, and most recently to social robotics and to moral machines. So that's probably enough to be going on with for now, I think.
Fantastic. Okay, that's really interesting. And just for those that maybe aren't that familiar with the term AI ethics, it would be great to sort of get your your opinion on what the definition, or what does AI ethics actually cover, just for everyone?
Yeah, sure. So my perception of it is that essentially the broadest definition would be it's a field of study and development where we're looking at the potential harm that AI could do to people, and also the potential good. Exploring the unwanted side effects of AI that may cause people to be disadvantaged, for example, in a certain situation, but also trying to optimize the benefit, the good for everybody. And it ranges from looking at things like bias in decision making, and transparency and explainability. Are you able to understand the decisions that an AI system makes and the basis on which it makes those decisions? Right the way through to the work that I'm personally working on myself, which is how we can develop AI and robots that have moral competence. In other words, we try and put the ethics inside the algorithm itself.
Fantastic. So I'm sure we'll delve a bit deeper into that aspect of AI ethics later on. So that's great. So appreciate that sort of definition. So the Institute for Ethical AI, I believe, was set up last year. I think you actually announced it at my conference last October, I believe. It would be great to maybe give us a bit more understanding what's the goals of the Institute, what are the kinds of things that you guys are looking at. That would be fantastic.
Sure, yeah, very happy to do that. So the Institute for Ethical AI, which was formally launched earlier this year, but has actually been in operation for 2 years now. The mission of it is to support businesses and organizations and governments in the safe and ethical development and deployment of AI products and technologies, and particularly to help businesses to integrate that technology within their business processes in a way which optimizes the benefits, but will also mitigate against the risks. And the makeup of the Institute is a core group of people. We have a team of about 6 or 7 now working full-time on this. And we also have a network of academics within the university that cover quite a broad range of disciplines. Obviously, we have a lot of expertise in AI itself, in machine learning and all the various technologies that underlie what we call AI. But we also have a network of people of other disciplines, which we've discovered is vital, really. If we're going to help businesses and organizations to safely and ethically use AI, we need people from business, the business discipline that understand how businesses function and the impact of business. We need people in law who understand about fairness, equality, and rights. We need anthropologists to be able to study the impact that AI has on people. So what we've done is we've assembled a network of about 25 to 30 academics from around the university, different disciplines, and we're all working together with this goal to support the good and ethical use of AI in industry, in commerce, and in government.
Okay, that's great. And obviously, a lot of your work is supporting businesses. Do you see a lot of interest from businesses at the moment? Because I think there's a whole range of businesses that are at different stages of their AI adoption, and certainly from the interactions I've had with businesses, they're aware of AI ethics and they're aware of some of the issues. And you mentioned data bias as being one element, and the transparency and explainable AI as another key one that most companies that have at least started their adoption journey are aware of those those challenges. But do you see an increasing interest in companies wanting to really not necessarily specialize, but to really get under the skin of what AI ethics is all about?
Yes, we do. There is definitely a growing interest in this area because people realize not only the power of the technology to do good, but obviously the risks that it also introduces that I mentioned earlier. In fact, what we've done in the Institute is focused mainly on two areas in order to be able to make a reasonable contribution. One of those is to work with the HR sector, which is making heavy use of AI. There is a mind-blowing number of AI products that you could buy as a HR manager and deploy within your organization, ranging from recruitment technology, CV scanners and all that, video-based interviews, through to employee engagement systems, and there's a huge number. And I think HR directors feel a little bit lost in the choice that they have and understanding, what the technology actually does and how beneficial it will be for them and how safe it is to use. And so what we've done is a consortium of HR directors mainly from large multinational companies that have that kind of issue. And we're working with them to understand their issues, helping them to understand the challenges of the technology. And it's really about hands-on practical support. We're not really, we do the research and we do the scientific underpinning, we do all that stuff. But the Institute's core purpose is to get out and be a practical support and guide. So that's one area. And the other area that we've majored in over the last few months is the law sector. Small to medium-sized law firms are very interested in using AI technology for various things, and we've assembled a consortium of those businesses, and we're working with them to be able to support them in that endeavor. So, I mean, there is a lot of interest out there. People are beginning to realize that there are efficiency gains to be made, and there's lots of benefits, but they need help in understanding the technology, and they want to know that the product that they're buying is valid and it's been tested properly. And that's one of the things that we're focusing on, is validation and testing of AI software, and use that as a kind of kite marking towards different products that a HR department or a legal firm might be able to use.
Okay, so that's essentially looking at AI vendor products and sort of validating whether they're under the hood, they've got that sort of ethical sort of capability or considerations that these companies that I guess HR firms and legal firms may not have a huge amount of deep technical expertise, so they're looking to you to ensure that they've got that sort of ethical considerations being factored into the product.
Yeah.
Are you working with sort of the more practical elements of supporting, for example, data science teams? So a lot of larger organizations might have their own data science team delivering different use cases for the company, and there still may be some concerns about the data bias and the explainability aspects, plus other considerations. Are you helping those types of organizations with their own data science teams to give them real, rather than just educating the data science team on the ethical concerns, but giving them or suggesting tools and frameworks that help them to not necessarily resolve those, but sort of manage those sort of issues? Is that something you guys do?
We've not done that regularly. There are one or two companies where we have met and discussed with their data scientists, and to just connect with them and understand what their challenges are. But in terms of actually support, what we're really aiming at is our organisations that don't have that kind of resource, that really are at sea when it comes to trying to understand what's out there and how to use it and how to integrate it into their businesses.
Yes.
And there are a lot of businesses in that bracket, huge numbers of them, that want to benefit from that. And just one thing I'd say about the particular angle on the law consortium is what we're doing there is, because a lot of these firms are too small to have their own technology people, never mind data scientists, quite a few of them don't have an IT person. And so what we're doing is, in the consortium, we're sort of developing a trusted group where we share data amongst the team. We share the development and testing of applications for them. They benefit. They often don't have enough data of their own to develop their, a bespoke AI system. But together in a consortium, they can share data, and we can get enough data then to train an algorithm, to train a system that will perform the kind of things that they particularly want to do, which is not necessarily the same as what the products, the large, the products that the large, top whatever 100 law firms might be using and can afford to buy.
Yes, that's really interesting, and I think over the next few years we're going to see a lot of smaller companies want to use AI technologies, but as you mentioned, they won't necessarily have the depth of technical experience in house to actually understand and make sure they're using the right tools for the right job. And actually, we've had a comment just come through on the chats, highlighting the fact that one of the challenges is, both in the HR world and also I'm sure in the legal world, there's such a plethora of tools that it can be very confusing for HR directors to understand what's the right tool to use. So I think that's an ongoing challenge for a lot of firms and for a lot of managers who maybe don't have the time or understanding to review the sort of 20, 30 sort of vendor products. So it's great that you're providing that sort of capability for them. So that's really good. One question that always pops up in my head, and there's been a lot of discussion. One of my interest areas is around facial recognition technology, and there's been a lot of talk about those technologies over the last sort of few months for various reasons. But one of the things that I'm quite passionate about is that I believe fundamentally the data sets that are used to train algorithms will always have some inherent bias in them in some shape or form. And I think it's quite a challenge to try and, create a data set that just doesn't have that. You can do synthetic data and you can balance the data sets and you can do all that kind of thing. But I think from my perspective is that there's always going to be some bias that sort of sneaks in there somehow. Do you agree? A, do you agree with that? And B, do you think what do you think are the right approaches to sort of deal with those kind of issues?
No, I agree entirely with that. I think that it's very difficult to arrive at a data set which is totally unbiased from any perspective. And of course, as we know, if you start off with a biased data set then and you use like conventional machine learning AI techniques, you will end up typically with a biased system. It will replicate the bias that it finds in the data. So, I mean, you pointed that there are ways of mitigating against that, which is true. So you can do balancing across to try and make the data set representative of the different categories that you're concerned about. You can generate artificial data to do that as well. There are data generators out there. It's quite easy to do. But I think that ultimately you'll always end up with a system that has some bias, and I think that's why it's important to have, a human in the loop. We ought not to be, wherever possible, we ought not to be just running these systems, walking away and taking their decisions and recommendations without actually monitoring the quality of those decisions and the ethical impact of those decisions.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and my take on it is actually because fundamentally there's always going to be some level of bias in the data. We actually need to look at the algorithms themselves and the architecture of the AI systems to actually build in some capability to manage and deal with that. So for me, I think that's the solution, and again, following on from a lot of the controversy and conversations around facial recognition technologies and the ethical concerns around that, there's been, again, a lot of talk about certainly with data science teams, or you need diversity in the data science team, which I totally agree with. Even outside of the ethical concerns, you need I think every team benefits from having diversity of opinions and perspectives. But personally, I don't see that as the fundamental issue for the biases that are coming into the systems, right? I think it's the data itself is just naturally biased for whatever reason. So that's an interesting one as well. So I think
one of the things that I'd say, following on from that, sorry, Andy, is we are very interested in the impact of this technology on people with disabilities. And when we talk about bias, often it's gender or race are the two that are focused upon. But actually, people with disabilities, who are quite a large proportion of society, surprisingly large, also suffer from bias. That could be down to the kind of technology that's used, so face recognition. If you've got a facial disfigurement, or if you've had a stroke, or it doesn't work.
Yeah.
If you've got a recruitment application, as we know, there is a recruitment product that uses video-based interviewing techniques. If it's analyzing your face as you're being interviewed, then you're going to be immediately at a disadvantage, because you'll be an outlier. You'll not fit into the curve of what the system is looking for. That's the point I want to make.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I know, actually, I've got a little bit of understanding of some of the applications used in the HR space, and some of them are using emotion detection as part of the facial recognition to see whether they think someone is stressed or potentially lying or whatever during sort of the interview. So again, not having a representative data set for people with disabilities will obviously affect that. So yeah, really, really interesting. Now, from my understanding, you're pretty much immersed in the sort of robotics side of things, and you mentioned earlier the sort of morality for robots. So it'd be great to get a bit more into that discussion. So can you tell us a little bit more of what you're doing in that space?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so I would say that over the last sort of 10 years, there's been a growing interest in this area of how we develop robots and AI systems generally, with a built-in degree of moral competence. Now, I'd say at the outset that this is a simulated moral competence, right? Because we can get into deep philosophical water very quickly here if we're claiming that robots can have real moral competence. But nevertheless, what I've found is that there is a growing need to put morals inside AI systems and inside robots. Can I give you three quick reasons why I think that?
Yes.
So the first one is the push for increased autonomy of robots. As robots are making more and more decisions without our help, That's what autonomous robots are. If you think of an autonomous vehicle, it makes decisions about how it's going to drive the car without our intervention. But as we push that further, and as robots make more and more decisions without us, what I think we'll find is that those decisions will have an ethical or a moral impact. And so there will come a point at which, you can't engineer that beforehand. You can't anticipate all the moral situations that a robot might find itself in before the product is released. There was a wonderful robot called Jibo. I don't know, do you remember that? It's about five or 6 years ago they developed it, and it was basically like a lampstand with a head that was, billed as, it was socially aware. It would interact with you, take photographs, tell stories to your children. And one of the promotional videos showed the robot in a girl's bedroom under her covers, and it was telling her a story, right? And it was and it looked lovely, it looked great. But as a parent, I can't begin to enumerate all the ethical issues that might be involved in, an internet connected device with a camera in a girl's bedroom, all that kind of stuff. And, you can't hardwire that in at engineering time. You can't tell people they can't do that. So what is for the context that it's in, and then to use that to make a decision about what is appropriate to do in that situation. So I think that's increasing autonomy. The second thing was increasing social embedding. So we're getting more and more robot products out on the market that are for use in the home. If you think about Alexa, how many people have Alexa? It's essentially a robotic device that is listening the whole time within your house to what you're saying. And it's socially embedded. We interact with it. We ask it questions, all that kind of stuff. And robots are becoming more and more like that. And I think as they do that, they'll come into situations like the child in the bedroom with the robot, where they need to be aware that there's things you do and don't do in those situations, morally right and wrong things. And then very quickly, the third thing that I think is driving us in this direction is human likeness. And there's a real push to make robots human-like. If you make it a little bit human, people will like it more. They might buy more of them. And human-like could be how it looks. It might look a little bit human in terms of the body, or it might sound human, or it might move in a human-like way. But all of those are ways of engaging people more and interacting with them. But the more human-like a robot is, the more you want to project onto it other human-like characteristics, like moral competence. And you might expect a human-looking robot to be able to know what it should and shouldn't be doing around other people. So those are the three drivers, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to delve into some of this because it's quite fascinating. So I'm interested, firstly, in your comment that you don't believe you can essentially pre-code a moral compass for AI agents, which I think I would slightly disagree with that, but I think I think there's complexities with that, because there's the different cultures have different moral compasses. I think individuals have a different moral sort of priorities, if you like. So I think there'll be a need for a baseline set of morality in pre-built, if you like, but then allowing you to tailor the robot that's in your own home to follow your own moral compass. And I think that's really fascinating, because sort of picking up on the self-driving car sort of issue, I think and it's interesting, I think I heard in the news this morning Tesla has sort of fourth quarter of profits, consecutive quarters of profit. And I think Elon Musk was, for a brief moment, the fifth richest man in the world because of the sort of cap of Tesla. So I think it's a fascinating area. But, do you foresee a future where you'd be able to imprint your own morals onto these agents? Because I wouldn't, should the moral compass be set by the company that built the robot, or should it be partly that but partly customized to yourself? And how does that happen? Because what happens in that transition where you're sort of training the robot to understand your own morality? It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think it's, I mean, it is a huge area, and you've touched on quite a number of things, even in that one question. And I totally agree with you, actually, that, there are risks here. You'll remember Microsoft Tay. I don't know if you heard of that, which
Yes.
was
Yeah.
a chatbot that became was released on the internet and had to be taken down within 24 hours.
It did, yeah.
It was emitting Nazi and anti-Semitic statements. It just learnt from the tweets that it had been sent, and it really didn't have a moral core, and which is what you're describing. And so, my answer to that is always the same. I would never let my child. I'm very careful about letting my child on the internet because of the influences that it can have on their early stage development, and I wouldn't do it with an AI. That's developing in the same way, and I think that is the way. I think that is the only way that you'll ultimately be able to develop moral competence in robots, is for them to learn and be taught it through experience, and that you have to do in a safe and contained environment, so that you know what it's learning, and it can develop a moral core before it then is released, and that moral core should be very stable. In other words, you shouldn't then be able to dislodge that over time. But you still, as you say, we want it to adapt to people's individual preferences in terms of their ethics. And the issue about cultural sensitivity is absolutely right. Each culture has its own set of morals, and you would have to be able to, if you're having a device that went to a different culture, it would need to adapt, and all that kind of stuff is very, very important. But yeah, so I think that we have to think about a very different process in building these kinds of machines, rather than engineering them at the beginning. When I talk about engineering, what I'm thinking is when you set up the drawing board and you're trying to map out all the possible circumstances that this device will be used, and then you design it from there. But in reality, I think that moral decisions and ethics are so complex, it's really hard to sort of define those ahead of time. So they have to be kind of
it's just amazing, isn't it? Because I think that could be a massive blocker for using autonomous robots in the home or whatever, because if you have to spend, I'm assuming it will be quicker than a sort of a human child learning their moral compass, but still it could be a little while of time for them to absorb your own moral compass, because it's only by example, right, that they're going to learn this, and you'll need those incidents happening in the real world where they can understand and learn. So I think that's going to be a massive challenge for companies who are building these technologies to, if you're right in saying that you can't sort of pre-build a level of moral compass sort of ahead of time. I think that's going to be certainly an interesting area for sure. And I think it's fraught with challenges. Interestingly, I was thinking, and you mentioned the sort of the Alexas and that we have in our home at the moment. I was thinking, and actually before the sort of pandemic, I was thinking, it'll only be a few years and Amazon will give us a robot at home that will sort of receive deliveries for us and pack them away in the kitchen or wherever. But of course now we're all working from home now, so we're all available to be the Amazon robot to sort of receive the packages now. So maybe that will cause Amazon to have a little bit of a delay in developing those technologies. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. There was also a study I read about a couple of years ago where they were testing the acceptance of a robot working with human teams, and they had two human teams, both with a robot that was helping them. One was programmed to be perfect, and every piece of work it was given, it did it perfectly. The other one made the occasional mistake, and after that experiment, they interviewed the two separate teams, and apparently the robot that occasionally made a mistake was more accepted into the team than the perfect robot. So it's not just about the moralities and the ethics, it's also about the behavior as well, isn't it, in terms of acceptance of these technologies. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We've got a few questions.
I've seen similar studies to that, where the mistakes, the occasional mistake by a robot, it was actually an unpacking robot, which made mistakes on unpacking things into the kitchen, and it put them in the wrong place, or it pointed to the wrong place to the human. And you're right, people somehow they like it more, when it's a bit fallible, and and slightly error prone. Obviously, there's a limit to that, but
Well, yes, and actually, I was talking to someone about this earlier in the week, and we were saying that, well, you don't want your robotic surgeon to be doing that, of course, but so there's limits to where you want that kind of human element of vulnerability. But yeah, I think it's quite fascinating. We've got quite a few questions coming through on the chat, so I'm just going to pick up a couple of these. So someone was actually going back to the HR and the interview. So one of the questions was around the sort of doing that without permission, and I think some sort of challenges around that. And I think that's, in some ways that's an AI ethical consideration, which is more around the sort of data privacy side of things, of course. And it's a very, very interesting area, I think. And I know of some capabilities in the HR space that are actually helping the interviewer as much as the interviewee, because it's actually giving the interviewer feedback on their interviewing style and approach. So I guess in that situation, you would have the permission of the actual company employee to be using that technology. But you can understand that if you were going for an interview, what's the sort of data privacy aspects of that. So again, this is all around the sort of facial recognition sort of side of things. So I think there's big areas of contention there. And
yes, so in the company that's leading on that is currently under a major lawsuit in the States. Apparently, because they're using video-based technologies to analyze facial movements and use that, they claim, in an unbiased way. But I think their claims are unfounded.
And we've got another question just about whether the government's taken an interest in this. And actually, I know the answer to this as well, because I'm part of the APPG group that advises the government. And only earlier this week, they had a session where they were discussing some of the ethics around facial recognition. So it's definitely on the radar of governments. But I think with what's happened with the Black Lives Matters campaign and some of the big tech firms slightly distancing themselves from the facial recognition technologies, that they actually want the government to come up with what are the regulations to use these technologies. So I guess that will be helping from an AI ethics perspective as well, won't it? Not that certainly personally, I don't want to see the industry overly regulated, but I think in certain situations, it's a good thing. You talked about the autonomous nature of some of these systems and the human in the loop in certain areas, and that when you mentioned that made me think of the sort of autonomous weapons area of using AI, which I guess is another major concern, and lots of ethical sort of focus there. And I know there's a number of people campaigning for not using sort of AI technologies in that space as well. But it's a fascinating area.
So we've just hired someone who's keen on developing that area within the institute, so that that we can have a voice in that space.
Okay,
so that's something
fantastic.
that we are beginning to look at.
And you mentioned, and I was doing some research on your website earlier today. So you mentioned the two consortia that you've got, one in the HR space and one in the legal space. Are you looking for other industries to create other consortia? Is that what you're hoping to achieve from the Institute?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. And we started the initial focus of the Institute on professional services. And so we're looking at this point in time to expand into other professional services area, but there are many areas. I mean, you could identify where, healthcare, for example, is a big one. And there are a number of areas that we're keen to get into. But at this stage, at this relatively early stage, we're trying to focus on these two particular areas, HR and law, so that we have an impact, so that we can actually do something good and don't spread ourselves too thinly. But we're always open to sort of exploring, individual partnerships and collaborations, beyond our main focus. So, if there's anyone out there who's an interest in working with us in this space, we'd be delighted to speak to you.
Okay, fantastic. And actually, someone's just raised an interesting point about, and I've been thinking about this as well from a sort of an oversight perspective on some of the technologies, that wouldn't there be, and I think you're kind of starting to do this with your sort of review of vendor products and your sort of kite mark, but having some kind of formal licensing or classification of some of these tools to say, these, and I guess that's kind of what your kite mark is trying to achieve, right? Is to sort of at least give guidance to say that we believe that this product is has consideration of ethical issues, right? So and maybe we see that sort of more wider over time, so it could be quite an interesting area for sure.
Yes, so in order to support that work, we're working pretty intensively on a risk classification system for AI systems.
Okay.
Similar to the risk classification system that's used in medical instrumentation. In fact, my co-director has a lot of experience in developing the original instrument classification system for medical applications, and we're using that experience to identify what are the major categories of risk and what the levels are, and what kind of authorization you might need sign off for, what level of authorization you might need sign off for particular risks. So ultimately, the idea is that each product will be given a risk sort of classification, and that will then be used to guide the sign-off process, I suppose, for its application and use.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And maybe something slightly more trivial, I guess, but the whole area, and actually I was talking to another professor of AI a couple of years ago, and he was doing a talk about should algorithms have rights? And I think this is quite an interesting area, isn't it? And I think the same could be applied for robots, and should robots have rights? But again, it's sort of thinking about where does the responsibility lie? So if you've got an AI system, who's responsible if that system goes wrong? Is it the company? Is it the data science team that sort of trained it up? Is it the vendor that sort of provides the platform for the system? So I think there's some interesting areas there. Is that an area that you guys look at?
Well, it's an area that we talk about a lot. It comes up a lot in the questions that we get asked. But I think the issue, whether algorithms should have rights or not, I don't believe they should. But I think for many cases, robots and algorithms, there is existing legal systems that will take care of whose responsibility it is at various points. The difference is, as you know, Andy, with AI systems is that they can adapt after production. And it's then who's responsible if it adapts, if it learns to do something that it ought not to be doing. Who's responsible for that, for the decisions that it makes from that point onwards, and then it becomes a little bit unclear. It could be, it could be the person who owns it, who's training it to do something that it shouldn't do.
And that kind of goes back to the earlier discussion about the morals and learning morals in your own home, right? Because what's to say that you don't, or for some reason, the robot you have in your house has got the wrong impression and come up with the wrong interpretation of a situation and come up with a moral that actually is completely opposite to what you were intending. So some interesting dilemmas there, I think.
Very challenging. I think the only solution to that is thorough testing as far as you can, and having benchmarks that you test against. Certain areas, like human physical safety, obviously is going to be one of them, but emotional safety and human rights all inform, the kind of benchmarks that we should be aiming for as a minimum standard.
And we've just had another question around the sort of responsibility, and again relating to self-driving cars. So if a self-driving car was involved in an accident resulting in a death, who's responsible? So my understanding of that, and maybe Nigel, you can correct me, it's the current level of self-driving cars isn't fully autonomous at the moment. So even in a Tesla car, you have to have your hands on the steering wheel, and it sort of alerts if you don't. So ultimate responsibility is still with the driver at the moment with the technology, but once they get to level 4, level 5, maybe that will change. So we'll have to sort of see. But I think again, it's a fascinating area, isn't it? So
it is. I think even at the higher levels of autonomy, you still want the human to have responsibility in the vehicle. If there is a human in the vehicle, there might not be. But so I think we can't abdicate responsibility completely. If it's a fault of the vehicle, then obviously the manufacturer is ultimately liable. But if it's a fault of how you've directed the vehicle or what instructions you've given it in how it should be driving, then you have to take responsibility as the user of the vehicle. But I can imagine it's a legal minefield.
Yeah, and going back to that point, right? So again, with the APPG conversations last year about, does the legal framework need to change to deal with AI and intelligent agents? And they had some representatives from the legal profession there, and their view was, well, the legal framework can cope with these things already. So they didn't believe at the time that they were needing to change or introduce new laws to sort of cope with it. But maybe that will change in the future. So we're coming 10 minutes to the end of the hour. So what I wanted to sort of do to try and wrap things up a little bit is just get your take on what do you think needs to happen in the industry, and whether this is the big sort of tech platforms that are building a lot of AI capabilities, or with the sort of bigger AI vendors and tool sets. What do you believe is needed to help support the better ethical use of AI? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm bound to say that the institute that we've set up is designed to try and address exactly this. So, I think that our job is to stand in the gap between the developers, the producers, the vendors, and the users, and to help both sides benefit. I mean, we're not there just to make things difficult for the producers and sellers of the technology. we want to actually help. We want their products to be safe. We want the users of that technology to be confident in the safety of their technology. So it's a win-win situation. So I think that, my suggestion is work with organizations like ourselves, and there are others, around the world, work with us, help us to identify, what are the strengths and weaknesses of your application, help us to put it through the validation and test sequence that we've developed, and be able to give feedback both to the developers and the vendors, and also to the users. And to me, that is the way we inform the user community, so they know what they're buying, they know what the risks are, and they know what the strengths are. But we also help the vendors to develop and increase the quality of the products that they're developing.
And do you need any support or help, do you think, to encourage the AI vendors to actually go through your certification and to sort of have that kite mark on their products?
I mean, there does need to be something. I'm not quite sure what that is. I mean, so I think, like you, I don't like regulation, total regulation, lockdown, because I think that would kill AI if you completely locked it down with regulation. On the other hand, so I think we need to arrive at a position of trust. Where, we have a system in place that partially regulated, but also has the freedom to develop new technologies in creative ways that will support and develop the applications within society and within business.
Okay, well, definitely as I start talking to AI vendors, I'm definitely going to mention this and encourage them to take the sort of the foresight to actually sort of adopt these things ahead. And I think the more we can do, the better, because the sooner we have that more acceptance and understanding that we need to look at these aspects, I think the better for everyone. So it's definitely a really important thing, and I think what you're doing and the rest of the researchers and team that you've pulled together with the Institute are doing sort of fantastic work. So really great to see, and thank you very much for being part of this show. It's been really, really great. We've had great engagement on the chat as well. So I've tried to cover as much as I can from the different questions, but really appreciate your time, Nigel, and thank you very much for taking an hour out to sort of share your views and understanding on the field of AI ethics. It's a fantastic, interesting topic, and I'm sure there will be many, many more years of discussion and evolution of the ethical frameworks and considerations around the sort of tools as they become more mainstream, and certainly as these wonderful delivery robots enter our sort of family homes. I think that's going to be an interesting development for us all, isn't it? So looking forward to seeing that for sure. So thank you very much, Nigel. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on the show. Thank you. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Thank you. All right. Thank you everyone who's joined as well. So please, as I say, please join and sign up for the podcast. So I'll be pushing out more weekly episodes very shortly. So thank you all, and look forward to next month's live show as well. Thank you all. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you.